Stop for a second and forget the oil price. That is the headline. That is the number flashing across the screen. That is what everybody is watching. But I do not think that is the thing that breaks first. The thing I would watch first is water. Not because water is more emotional than oil, not because it makes a better television image, but because in the Gulf, water is not a side issue. It is not a humanitarian footnote tucked underneath an energy war. It is the operating system of daily life. If you take the oil away, an economy slows down. If you take the water away, a society starts counting hours. That is the part of this crisis that most market coverage still does not understand. The Gulf does not only run on hydrocarbons, it runs on desalination. Qatar gets roughly 99% of its drinking water from desalination. Bahrain is around 90%. Kuwait, Oman, and Saudi Arabia are all heavily dependent on it. Even the UAE, with all its diversification and all its futuristic branding, still relies on desalinated water on a scale that would shock most outsiders. The system looks modern and resilient until you remember what it actually depends on: power pipelines, grid stability, constant, uninterrupted operation. And that means you do not need to destroy a skyline to trigger panic. You do not even need to destroy an oil terminal. You only need to make people think the pumps may stop. That is why I think the most dangerous target in the Gulf right now is not an oil field. It is the chain that turns seawater into civilian survival. If that chain is threatened, the entire market conversation changes. Oil is no longer the whole story. The story becomes this: if the Gulf begins to look less like an energy shock and more like a basic survival shock, then the countries most exposed to imported energy, imported stability, and imported confidence are suddenly in a completely different position. And that is where Japan enters the story. This is the mistake people keep making. They treat the Gulf and Japan as two separate headlines. One is a war story, the other is a currency story. I think that is exactly backward. They are the same story. The Gulf is the trigger, Japan is the transfer mechanism, and the final destination of that pressure is the American bond market. Let me put the chain together as simply as possible. If the Gulf crisis deepens, energy prices stay elevated. If energy prices stay elevated, Japan gets squeezed harder than most major economies because it imports almost all of the fuel it burns. If Japan gets squeezed harder while the yen is already weak, its import costs become much uglier than the global benchmark price suggests. A barrel at one price to the rest of the world can feel like a much higher price inside Japan once the exchange rate does its damage. That is how an oil shock becomes a currency shock and then a policy trap. And Japan is already sitting in that trap. Under normal conditions, a government trying to defend a weakening currency has a textbook answer: raise rates, make the currency more attractive, slow the damage. But Japan is not operating under normal conditions and has not been for a very long time. Its debt load is enormous. Its fiscal room is tighter than the label suggests. Its interest burden is already projected to become far more painful over the next several years. That means the clean answer is not really available. If Japan tightens too aggressively, it risks detonating stress inside its own system. If it does not tighten, the yen keeps bleeding and the imported energy bill keeps climbing. That leaves a smaller set of ugly choices. And once you get to ugly choices, you have to start watching the asset that sits quietly in the background until the moment it no longer sits quietly. United States Treasuries, Japan sits on roughly $1.2 trillion of them. That is not just a large number. It is the largest foreign pile of U.S. government debt on the planet. For years, that holding has been treated as a symbol of system stability. The assumption underneath it is that Japan is one of the pillars of the existing order, so those bonds are safe from sudden disorder. But crises do not care about symbolism. If Tokyo is cornered badly enough, the meaning of that treasury pile changes. It stops being a reserve asset and starts becoming a pressure release valve. This is the chain I think investors are still underpricing. The first link is Gulf vulnerability. The second is energy stress. The third is yen weakness. The fourth is Japanese policy paralysis. The fifth is the possibility that Japan, unable to solve the problem cleanly through rates, starts looking for liquidity, flexibility, and defense through its external balance sheet. And the most important thing on that balance sheet is treasuries. Now, I am not saying Japan wakes up tomorrow morning and dumps a full stack. That is lazy analysis, and it is not how serious governments operate. But you do not need a full liquidation for the pressure to matter. In a system already hypersensitive to yields, even a partial shift, even a meaningful signal, even an intervention path that forces investors to ask whether Japan may need to use its treasury position more actively can move markets fast. And the American market knows this, whether it says it out loud or not, because when yields start moving higher, the pain does not stay in Washington. It moves into mortgages, it moves into auto loans, it moves into credit cards, it moves into corporate refinancing, it moves into equity valuations. It moves into every corner of the real economy that spent years pretending cheap money was a permanent climate condition. It never was, it was weather. And weather changes, that is why this is not a foreign policy story that happens to touch markets. It is a market story already disguised as foreign policy. Look at the structure. Oil pushes inflation risk higher. Higher inflation risk keeps the Federal Reserve boxed in. A boxed-in Fed cannot easily ride to the rescue. At the same time, a worsening Gulf shock hammers the yen and raises the probability that Japan is forced into more visible defensive action. At the same time, the Treasury market is already carrying the weight of large issuance, rate sensitivity, and investor nerves. Now, layer on one more question. What if the biggest foreign holder of US debt suddenly needs flexibility more than it needs passivity? That is how you get from a threatened desalination system in the Gulf to a repricing event in American assets. And this is exactly why I think the water angle matters so much. It changes the tempo of the crisis. Oil shocks are terrible, but they are often discussed in weekly and monthly terms. Water stress is psychologically faster. People do not hear that a country may lose drinking water stability and calmly model the next quarter. They react now. Governments react now. Markets react now. The political tolerance for delay collapses. Once that happens, every exposed country starts moving in a more panicked way, and panicked systems pass stress outward faster than orderly systems do. So the real danger is not just that the Gulf becomes expensive. The real danger is that the Gulf becomes unstable in a way that accelerates every downstream decision. That acceleration is what could push Japan from discomfort into emergency mode. And emergency mode is where the Treasury question stops being theoretical. There is another reason this matters. A lot of people still talk about the American bond market as if it is a giant ocean that cannot be disturbed by one external actor. In normal times, that is mostly true, but these are not normal times. This market is already watching inflation, deficits, issuance, geopolitics, and recession risk all at once. It is already primed to overreact to anything that looks like a structural shift in demand. So even if Japan does not become a full-scale seller, the fear that it might be pushed in that direction can do damage all by itself. That is how modern crises work. You do not need the final event. Sometimes you only need the market to start believing the final event is no longer impossible. And that is why I would frame this entire story with one mechanism. The survival to liquidation chain. First, the Gulf faces a survival pressure through water vulnerability. Then, Japan faces a national balance sheet pressure through energy and currency stress. Then, the United States faces a financial pressure through the Treasury market. That is the real chain reaction here, not missiles to oil to gas stations. That is the shallow version. The deeper version is infrastructure to confidence to sovereign balance sheets. Watch what happens next in three places. Watch Gulf infrastructure, especially anything tied to power and desalination. Watch the yen, because once that starts looking disorderly, Japan's room to stay patient narrows very fast. And watch us yields, because if this story really is traveling the path I think it is traveling, the bond market will tell you before most politicians do. That is the part almost everybody misses in real time. The headline event happens in one country, but the break usually appears somewhere else first. In this case, the first crack may not show up in an oil chart at all. It may show up in Tokyo. And from Tokyo, it may move straight into the American cost of money. That is why I would not watch oil first tonight. I would watch the systems that tell you whether this is still an energy shock or whether it is becoming something much bigger. Because once a Gulf water threat becomes a Japanese funding problem, and Japanese funding problem becomes an American yield problem, this stops being a regional crisis. It becomes a global repricing.